Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the ministry at Thessalonica and Berea in our continuing study of Acts. We're going to be in Acts 17, verses 1 through 15. We left off, you remember that Paul had departed from Philippi, and now he comes to the city of Thessalonica. If I slip and call it Thessaloniki, that's how it is pronounced today. The city's still there today. And remember that Paul is walking. I came across his statue. Actually, we were traveling through Greece a number of years ago, and the statue was broken from the knees up. And I was just walking past it, and all of a sudden I stopped and look, and what caught my eye was the intricate workmanship of the sandaled feet, and it reminded me of that passage that Paul quotes from Isaiah. How beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel. And as I was traveling through Greece, I was getting using local transportation, buses and things like that. Um, but Paul, he was walking his way across all of the areas that we've seen, and it was just a good reminder for me. Verse 1, now when they had traveled through Amphipolis, and these are some of the cities along the way, and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Now, Thessalonica, the city itself, is on the seaport. It gets its name. It was actually named after the half sister of Alexander the Great. She had been named after a big victory that her father had won over Thessaly. And so the way you say victory at Thessaly's, Thessaloniki, remember how they talk about the Nike shoes? That actually means victory. And so it was named after the half sister of Alexander the Great, and the name had stuck. And you can go there, and on a clear day, and usually it's not clear. These days, there's a lot of smog in the air. But I happened to take this picture. It had rained that night, and we got up early the next morning and looked out across the Bay of Saloniki, and there you can see in the distance Mount Olympus that overlooks the city. It had been made self-governing by the Romans, so even though it's under Roman control, they have city politarchs. We're going to see that term used in just a bit. And they ruled over the city, and therefore it retained its Greek culture, very strong Greek influence within the city. And yet there was also a Jewish presence that is described here in the book of Acts. Now, we have not yet located the ruins of the synagogue. By the way, what you're looking at, Thessaloniki, today is the second largest city in all of Greece, with Athens being the first largest. And you say, well, why do they have these ruins? Actually, I'm told that in the early 1900s, there was an earthquake that damaged portions of the city, and these were the portions of the city were left in ruins for a time, and they were going to build a big shopping mall or something like that, and so they dug down to the foundation, and as they dug, they found these ruins underneath the modern city, and the archaeologists said, "Hold up, you're gonna have to move the shopping mall somewhere else," and they have this entire antiquities section. It dates back to the first century, if not earlier. Um, and you can go there in Thessaloniki, and in the middle of the bustling city, you have this ancient city square. And you can see, for example, we're looking at the Odeum, sort of like a miniature theater. And it spotlights the Greek culture that was present in the city. Verse 2, and according to Paul's custom, he went to them, that is, to the Jewish people, the synagogue, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the scriptures. Now, that doesn't mean he only stayed in Thessalonica for 3 weeks, but this is how long he was permitted to stay to come and speak in the synagogue. And so he's there for 3 Sabbaths, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying, this Jesus who I am proclaiming to you is the Christ. Now notice what the message is, and this was Paul's custom to do this. He would always go to the synagogue first. Why do you go to the synagogue first? Well, that's where the people are who already know the scriptures. Sort of like the man, the bank robber was asked, why do you rob banks? And he would say, well, that's where the money is. This is where the people who already understood the scriptures, this is where they were located. And so he would begin by reasoning to them from the scriptures that the Messiah had to suffer. The Messiah is the Old Testament teaching. And then he would point out that Jesus suffered, which means that Jesus fulfilled, and that wasn't the only thing he did to fulfill it, but that was contrary to their expectation. And yet the scriptures itself pointed to the suffering of Messiah. And so therefore they could conclude that Jesus is the Messiah. That's how his reasoning went. Notice this Jesus, whom I'm proclaiming to you, is, notice we're using the word Christ, which is just the Greek term for the Hebrew word Messiah. They both mean the anointed one, speaking about the Messiah from the Older Testament. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a great multitude of the God-fearing Greeks and a number of the leading women. So notice there are some Jewish believers and sounds like a lot more Gentile believers, the God-fearing Greeks, people who had been interested in the goings-on in the synagogue, had come to worship the God of the synagogue, but had not yet become proselytes. That is, they had not yet been circumcised. And now they find out from Paul, well, you can become a Christian. You don't have to be circumcised. And also a number of the leading women. Now, these leading women, some might have been Jewish, some might have been Gentile. We're not told specifically about them. But some of them now were persuaded, and a lot more are following, of the Gentiles are following this new faith of Christianity. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace. Remember, we were just looking at pictures of the ancient marketplace. Well, they went and gathered them up. Notice the Jews solicit and gain the actions of some of the Gentiles, and they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar, and coming upon the house of Jason. Now, we haven't been introduced to Jason yet, but evidently Jason was the host of this brand new church and the host of Paul and Silas and others that were coming to the faith. And notice they were seeking to bring them out, that is, Paul and his team, Paul, Silas, Timothy, Luke, anybody else that had joined them in the interim. So notice the Jews are doing this, and they come against Jason. Now, Romans chapter 16 and verse 21, and I don't know if it's the same Jason, but Paul is writing to the Romans, and he says, Timothy, my fellow worker, greets you, and so do Lucius and Jason, and then he goes on, and Sosipater, my kinsman. Now, this suggests, if it's the same Jason, even though he's got a Greek name, and Jason is a Greek name, that he's one of those Jewish people from the synagogue that had believed. And because notice, Paul calls them my kinsmen, if that is indeed the same Jason. Verse 6, when they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities. Now, the term city authorities, tos politarchos, it's actually an unusual term. In fact, many years ago, there were critics that said, that term wasn't used by the Greeks until the 2nd century, and so therefore Luke must have written his book much later. Well, since then, since they've done the archaeological excavations right there in Thessaloniki, they have found not once, but bunches of times where this term was used in Paul's day, and it seems like even earlier. And so that's not a sign that Luke wrote much later. In fact, Luke knows exactly the proper term to use. Remember how I said that the Romans had given the city fathers here, the politarchos, the city authorities, that's a good translation, had given them quite a measure of independence. Now, they were still under Rome, but instead of having a Roman magistrate, they had their own city authorities. And notice they were shouting, these men who have upset the world have come here also. and Jason has welcomed them, and they all, and notice what the charge is, they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. So notice they're claiming, and this sounds remarkably like what the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, I should say, had said to Pilate when they had Jesus crucified. He makes himself out to be a king, and we have no king but Caesar. Well, here they're doing the same thing. There's another king, Jesus. And it's true that Jesus is a king, but he's not a secular king. He's not a king who's setting up a secular kingdom. And so what they're doing is they're twisting the message in order to try to compel and get these politarchs, these city authorities, against these new Christians. Verse 8, they stirred up the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things, and when they had received a pledge from Jason and the others, they released them. Notice it gets stirred up, and and Jason's not going anywhere. He says, "No, we're going to behave ourselves. We're not trying to set up a king instead of Caesar. We're not trying to do any sort of political stance here where we're trying to overthrow the government." And so notice they sort of let him out on bail, I guess you could say, and that seems to be the end of the trouble. Well, verse 10, and the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. Remember, they had come looking for Paul and Silas. They hadn't found them, they had taken Jason instead. And when they arrived, Berea is about 45 miles as the crow flies, but they're not crows. They might have had to go around the bay to get there. And it's due west, a little bit to the south, but due west of Thessalonica. Um, and when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. This is the same thing that they did in the previous location. Now, Berea is much smaller. Verse 11, now these were more noble-minded, and that's a very literal translation. It actually has the word good nobility, sort of noble upbringing is sort of the idea, but noble-minded works. And they were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received, and we're talking about people in the synagogue, they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily. Notice they didn't just hear it and they say, okay, now we're Christians. No, we want to hear what you have to say. We want to search the scriptures. We want to check that out. And so apparently it sounds like there's a whole study session that encompasses maybe days or even weeks. Notice to see whether these things were so. They hear the message, and instead of categorically denying it, they say, well, let's check out, let's look at the evidence to see if it might be true. Verse 12, many of them therefore believed, along with a number of prominent, and this time we're told Greek women, but also men. So there's both Greeks and there's Jewish folk who believe. Actually, I took this picture in Berea. There's a big church there commemorating these actions. I have to wonder, did that church start off as a synagogue? And as they all believed, and I don't know if they all believed, but many of them did it become, and I don't know if that's the case. It's interesting that when we come to Acts chapter 20 and verse 4, we're going to see Paul continuing his travels, and he will be accompanied there by somebody named Sopater of Berea, the son of Pyrrhus. So here's at least one person who maybe became a convert at this time, who's going to be joined to Paul's missionary team. Verse 13, but when the Jews of Thessalonica found out that the word of God had been proclaimed by Paul in Berea also, they came there as well, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then immediately the brethren sent Paul out to go as far as the sea, and Silas and Timothy remain there. So Silas and Timothy apparently aren't generating quite so much heat. Paul is known as the sort of the ringleader and the speaker, the leader of the group, and so they take him out of town, and they're going to find some passage for him as they go to the sea. Verse 15, now those who escorted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they left. So notice we've gone from Philippi to Thessaloniki, to Berea, and now Paul himself comes to Athens, and we'll pick up next time with Paul in Athens as he's waiting to be rejoined by the rest of his team, by Silas, by Timothy, and whoever else might be joining them. Now, in closing, I want to look at Paul's epistle that he's going to write, not at this time, but a bit later, not too much later, and he's going to be writing to the Thessalonians. He says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 8, "For the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you, not only in Macedonia," and that's where we've been reading about, "and Achaia, but also in every place. Your faith toward God has gone forth, so that we have no need to say anything." You see, the church that's planted here, in spite, maybe because of the persecution and opposition, is going to be noted for its faith. He goes on, verse 8, "For they themselves report about us what kind of a reception we had with you." Notice Paul's going to sort of retell the story very briefly that we've just read about, and how you turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God. Now, what he's telling us here is that the church at Thessalonica there had been some Jewish people, but it was mostly Gentile. Because those are the people that had turned to God from idols. Jewish people had turned to God, but they turned to Jesus as the Messiah. They were already worshiping God. But the Gentiles, for them, this was a brand new faith. Notice verse 10, "And to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, that is Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath to come." And then we jump down to chapter 2, verse 14. "For you, brethren," this is also in his first epistle to the Thessalonians, "for you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea." You see, the pattern was the church in Jerusalem. And even though this is a Gentile church, they're copying them in the sense, here it is, "For you also endured the same sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews." The church in Jerusalem was persecuted by the Jews. He says to the Thessalonians, "And you were persecuted by your people are the Gentiles, the Greeks, the people of Thessalonica, and you were persecuted too." Notice who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. And he's speaking back to those Jewish persecutors, "they are not pleasing to God, but hostile, not just to us, to all men, hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they might be saved, with the result that they always fill up the measure of their sins. But wrath has come upon them to the uttermost." You see, it's a warning that God takes seriously those who mess with his people, and God especially takes seriously those who mess with the proclamation of his good news to the world.